Most people will be familiar with the idea of an ongoing struggle between science and religion. My 2-volume book, 10 Ways to Weave the World, arises from a feeling that this simple polarization is problematic for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, the science versus religion slogan presents religion and science as static blocks, whereas we all know there are many religions with many approaches to God, from a kind of atheism in Buddhism, through Pantheism and Panentheism, to Theism and Deism. And there are many different sciences, each with their own methodology, some of which seem far more anti-God than others. These days biology seems to lead the atheism field, with physics and cosmology more ambivalent. But again, individual biologists, physicists and cosmologists vary. Secondly, the slogan betrays our love of oppositions. We like to have at least 2 sides, just 2 sides, so we can have a clear argument. Religion, which is based on faith, is said to be opposed to science, which is based on reason. Religion, so say, invokes God and purpose in the universe, whereas science explains the universe in its own terms, resorting to no occult outside forces. Religion favours spirituality and the soul, while for science the physical world is all there is. Religion is dualistic, believing in a spiritual world and a material world. Science offers only one world, the material one. Religious truths are issued by an authority or magisterium and believed in by the body of believers who submit to it. Scientific truths are established by reason and experiment, which can, in principle, be repeated by any individual, and so on. It's obvious that the polarization presents only half the truth about religion and about science. We need to ask questions like, is there not a lot of rational debate in all the main religions? And do scientists not need faith in their methods? Does the unprovable non-existence of God not require a kind of atheistic faith? Is the idea that nature is subject to law, not in its origins a religious idea, to be found in Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, among other faiths? Would all scientists agree that there is no place for spirituality, or what we call soul, in their systems? Are all religions dualistic? Have not some offered monism, belief that all things are one, or of one kind? Does science not have its academies and corporate traditions? And was it not the religious who first championed the role of individual conscience in the face of institutional authority? And did science in fact arise in a material context? Did the early scientists not mostly hold to dualism, with a law-abiding universe underpinned by a lawmaker God? We shall see. This leads us to the third point. Dualism and materialism need to be set in a wider context. They are just 2 of a range of ways of understanding the world, all of which have their own implications for science and religious belief. My book develops the concept of what I call a world. This needs some explanation. Roughly, a world selects a small group of fundamental truths and offers rules for deriving the other truths from those truths and from one another, until we get to all the truth about what things there are and are not, and about what should be done, and what God is, if anything, and so forth. Materialism, for example, is the world for which fundamental truths are truths about very small bits of matter, and the rules are rules about their relations and how they can fit together into bigger bits. Dualists think that a complete explanation of the universe also needs another fundamental set of truths about mind and mental relations, of rational deduction and purpose. But why should these be the only alternative worlds? What about the idealists, who think we only need the mental set of truths and rules, or Aristotle and his followers, for whom the fundamental truths are, roughly, truths about things that have both mental and physical aspects. For a full, balanced grasp of science and religion, we need to see what the impact of these worlds and others might be. In the course of our world tour, we shall see that the attempt to construct a definitive, self-consistent and all-encompassing world is a pipe dream. We have to invent and approximate. In the book, and in this talk, I lead the reader through 10 worlds with their different implications for life, the universe, and everything. In the book, the worlds appear as a number 1 to 10, enclosed in curly brackets, meant to suggest something a bit spherical like a world, but curly and open-ended. The weaving of the book title again suggests we do not manufacture worlds by a mechanical process, but weave together the things that seem true to us in an open-ended way. A world has to be capable of adding new truths when we find them. Why 10 worlds, you may be asking? There is no magic about this number. How could I possibly prove there are no other possible ways of weaving a world? It's just that I find that the 10 represent fairly the main worlds that have arisen historically, and they are enough to offer the reader an interesting journey from a beginning to an end, the end being the world I would like to be living in. We encountered dualism and materialism early on, but then moved forward to worlds like the multiverse that seem to be succeeding then. Then we go back to the worlds like the Aristotelian that pre-existed or coexisted with them. Often we find worlds that come before and after dualism and materialism, which is why I could not tell you whether this is a pre-modern, modern, or postmodern book. Once again, reality is more complex than that. I don't follow the fashion of offering a methodology to justify my way of arguing. I generally try to combine a speculative openness on the large scale with Anglo-Saxon analysis on the small scale. I think this works. But the reader, or in this case the watcher of this video, will have to be the judge of that, though in the video I can only really give an idea of the large scale, not the detailed arguments. So to world number 1, naive realism. I have a strange memory from my childhood when I was about 9 or 10. I vaguely remember it happening in my back garden, but it is all very unspecific, and I do not recall what occasioned the thought. But I remember thinking that the world had somehow lost its immediacy, its vividness. I was no longer immersed in the world. It was as if the veil of thought had intervened. Before, it had never occurred to me that the world was not just as it seemed, full of real objects like cats and trees and people, and full of real qualities like the green of the grass and the black of the blackbird. But now, a little philosopher had grown up in me, telling me quite different scientific story of a world that consists of atoms and space and light rays, none of them coloured. And although I had no doubt there were people in the world other than myself, I felt now that I could not tell at all how other people saw what I saw as green or black. How did I know they did not experience my green as red or the sound of a trumpet? Their worlds were closed to me and mine to them. I don't know if this rings bells with you, but it describes a world that is said to exist before we advance philosophical theories about it, a world that is just as it seems and just as we describe it. It is called direct realism because what we see is what is there, not some thought or image of what is there. When I see the red squirrel eating a nut on my green lawn, the squirrel is really there and really red and really eating the nut while being positioned on the lawn, which again is real and really green. Some call this idea pejoratively naive realism because it is thought to arise from a lack of sophisticated thought. I have to say that after years of philosophical doubt, I have, in the writing of this book, returned to the naive view. Unless I have good reason to believe otherwise, when I think I am seeing a red squirrel, that is exactly what I am seeing. Why should I believe I am only really seeing some surrogate or mental replica of the animal? What is not to like about naive realism? Well, at least three things. First, as we shall see from René Descartes in World 2, there is always the possibility of illusion. There may be a gap between what I believe to be there and describe to be there and what actually is there. I may believe I see what I describe as a squirrel, but it may be something else, like a pine marten, or more radically, it may not be there at all, and I may be hallucinating the image of a squirrel, or Descartes' own favourite example, deceived by some demon. Modern philosophers prefer to speak of an evil scientist who has implanted electrodes in my brain that switch on the red squirrel belief. But the import is the same. Descartes believed, perversely some might say, that the only way to certain truth is to doubt everything we possibly can and see what is left. So the philosopher who seeks the truth has to let go of naive realism. In World 2, we should consider whether this radical doubt is, after all, the best approach to truth. Secondly, and perhaps more persuasively for most of us, science offers us a world that is very unlike the world of naive realism. Science says that when I have a sensation or a belief in my seeing a red squirrel on a green lawn, there is nothing really red or really green there. There is only a range of light waves scattering down, well, not really down, from the sun, activating molecules in the grass and the squirrel fur, so they emit light of a different wavelength. These hit the retina of my eye, which then transmits signals to neurons in my brain, and these signals register quite mysteriously as experience of green and red. Only at the very last stage does experience occur. I describe this as experience of a red squirrel on a green lawn, but nowhere outside of my mind do those items appear as the coloured things I think I see. As we shall see, there are various ways of dealing with what we may call the non-appearance of the obvious. But if we want to retain realism regarding squirrels and lawns, it cannot be via the direct or naive route. And finally, there is a third, more postmodern sort of question about whether naive realism can be as naive as it seems. As a child, I believed I saw a squirrel, or a grey one in this case, who came to eat food from our kitchen windowsill until he got too bold. He came into the kitchen itself, and in order to take one of my mother's recently cooked biscuits, he upended the whole tray. After that, he was banished. I saw in him just a rodent of the squirrel kind. I did not, for example, see a god who was manifesting as a being whom I could please by feeding. If I had suggested anything like that to my parents, they would have just laughed or given me a strange look. And yet, red squirrels are intensely beautiful, and it's hard to imagine that they are not slightly supernatural and pixie-like. And some people in the world might well see them as being so. This raises the question of whether there is a simple, direct way of seeing things as they really are, or whether, as the postmoderns say, experience is always already theory-laden. We select what we see, at least partly, according to the way we learn, mostly as a child. I described my loss of naive realism as like a bereavement of the childhood perception I had once had. But I now wonder whether I ever really had such an innocent perception. The curious thing is that most of my memories begin around the age when I had this sense of loss, or think I did. Before that age, I ought to have been having vivid, direct experiences, but the opposite is true. I cannot remember much of my life before that age. Everything I do remember from that early time is remembered in terms of what my parents have said happened to me. It is since I lost my direct realism that I began to experience the world in my own independent way. Already in World 1, our questions lead us to other, more sophisticated worlds. The first question leads to World 2 and Descartes' doubt, and so perhaps to his dualism. The second leads to the emptying of the real world of experience and value, the materialism of World 3 and the structural realism of Worlds 4 and 5. And the third option opens the possibility that other ways of seeing the world that are full of mind and the supernatural may be possible. The Pantheism of World 6 and the Idealism of World 7. So can we come to World 2, Dualism. Modern philosophy is often seen as starting with René Descartes. In histories of philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, and perhaps even Thomas Aquinas get a mention. But sometimes it seems in the way an ornithologist might mention in passing the dinosaurs that were the distant ancestors of the birds, which are his real subject. Descartes is renowned for two related ideas. One idea has to do with ontology, or the theory of what exists. This idea is dualism, strictly speaking, substance dualism. The idea that the world consists of two distinct kinds of thing. There is matter, which is spatially extended and unconscious, and there is mind, which is non-spatial and conscious. It follows that my mind is distinct from and independent of my own body. I have on the one hand a clear and distinct idea of myself, taken simply as a conscious, not an extended being, and on the other hand a distinct idea of a body taken simply as an extended, not a conscious being. So it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and could exist without it. So writes Descartes. Here Descartes was articulating a dualism which many, if not most, of his contemporaries believed in. Many people still do. This dualism is our world too. The other idea has to do with epistemology, or the theory of how we know things. Descartes pioneered the method of doubt. To know what is sure and certain, he believed, we must try being unsure of everything we reasonably can. Descartes decided that in this process of doubting everything, there was one thing he could be absolutely sure of. There was a thought process going on, namely doubting, and this could not be doubted. Nor could the fact that the thinking had to be thought by a thinker, namely himself. Hence his famous quote, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. There is a kind of chicken and egg relationship between Descartes' dualism and his method of doubt. The doubt sets the mental realm of thinking and doubting above the material world as the realm that is immune from doubt. I can wonder, have I really got this body I think I have? But I cannot wonder, am I now thinking that I have this body? The mental world of thought and appearance is self-evident in a way that the physical world is not. That immediately sets the mental world apart from the physical. In fact, to get to certainty about the physical, Descartes used his mental ideas to prove the existence of a perfect being called God. He then argues that a perfect being would not be perfect if the physical world were a deception, which he tricked us into believing. This divide between the known mental world and the inferred physical world is fundamental not just to Descartes, but to world too generally. This was the world that saw the rise of scientific method in the early modern period, from say the 15th to the 17th centuries. That period saw the replacement of an older Aristotelian world, which we will encounter as World 8, with one which saw the world as amenable to scientific explanation. Nature was believed to be machine-like in that it could be analysed into parts, each of which operated according to mathematical laws which human investigation could discover through experiment. The qualities that could be quantified in the mathematical laws, basically number, mass, size, shape and motion, were regarded as the primary qualities that were objectively there. The qualities science could not touch, colour, smell, texture and so forth, were regarded as secondary qualities that exist only in the mind. So dualism created its characteristic polarity between matter, which has no real qualities, and mind, where qualities reside, along with thoughts and arguments. What happened to God in all this? Well, it surprises many to learn that most of the early scientists and philosophers believed in God. The God in question might be, as for Descartes, the orthodox Christian God, or he might be a deist variant. Deists despised the church dogma, but invoked God for the still necessary function of designing, building, and starting off the cosmic machine. The logic of dualism seems to necessitate a God who is separate from the world as the human soul is separate from its body. What is hard to retain is the notion of a God who, as for classical theism and the likes of Thomas Aquinas, fills and animates the cosmos without being contained by it. Dualism is not popular these days with philosophers or scientists or religious believers. Scientists dislike the lazy resort to God to fill the gaps in explanation. They also ask why, if mind is substantially separate from God, our body, our minds are so dependent on our physical senses and change so radically when our brain states change, for example, in sleep. Philosophers ask, if body and mind are so substantially distinct, how can each affect the other so intimately, and how can ideas that are mental ever represent something in a totally different physical category? Finally, people of faith, though frequently assumed to be dualists, often reject dualism as contrary to their own traditions. In Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism and Buddhism, the practice of faith is always bodily as well as mental. It is far from surprising, then, that having consigned quality, experience and value to the realm of the mind, and explaining the material world mechanistically, scientists eventually turned to try explaining the mental things in the mechanical, material way. If successful, after all, that move would give us back a monistic, unified world. If mind and matter are made of the same physical stuff, we do not have to cope with how mind can change matter, and vice versa. That is one way for God to die. It is not a dramatic or apocalyptic death, but something like the death described in Philip Pullman's Amber Spyglass. To protect the Ancient of Days from the incursions of matter, he has been encased in a glass chariot. In the same way, we have protected value by encasing it in the glass chariot of the soul, with God as chief soul. Once the glass is broken, God and the soul dissolve back into the material universe. Blake's image of the dualist God is depicted on the cover of my first volume. He sets his measuring compass on the face of the deep and looks almighty until you see that he is encompassed in a fragile sphere of cloud. The new atheists seem to me to be trapped in the motion of killing off the God of dualism, but their fury is wasted. That job has been done. Not many people believe in that God anymore. There are other worlds before and beyond dualism with gods that have more power, or more subtlety, or more enchantment. And so to World 3, Materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Thus says evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin in a well-known comment. To those who assume that science has discovered the absence of God, the words may come as a shock, for here the absence of God is an a priori tenet. The possibility that God might get his foot in the door and begin to peddle his wares like a tawdry salesperson is seen as a temptation and a real threat. This has suggested to me the term theophobia, or fear of God. Materialism could be regarded as the adolescent child of dualism. Materialists are often trenchant, like Lewontin, in their abhorrence of anything that reeks of the soul, purpose, or God. Yet as we just saw, it is dualism that nurtured the conceptual framework of science. The materialist child inherits a great deal from the dualist parent. The discoverable laws that govern nature, the machine as a model for the world, the need to jettison subjectivity and take an objective stance, and space as the plenum out of which the laws play out. There are just three things the materialist child has to reject, but they make all the difference. These three tweaks turn the principles that guide scientific method into tenets of the framework which all true scientists must adhere to. The three tweaks are nominalism, naturalism, and atheism. Nominalism is the belief that concepts and ideas do not refer to real entities, but are ways of talking about collections of physical things. Plato would have seen the term red as referring to a real quality of redness, and Descartes would have seen it as denoting a clear idea of the colour red. But for nominalism, it is just a way of referring to the group of things, chairs, squirrels, stars, etc., that happen to be red. Nominalism was pioneered by William of Ockham in the 14th century, but most of the early modern scientists and philosophers were realists about ideas. Only with Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century did nominalism begin to gain a hold. Nominalism turns the mechanistic universe into a reductionist universe. From being a coherent, planned whole, the universe becomes a random collection of bits and pieces that somehow self-assemble. And materialism follows from the loss of the reality of ideas and of the mental realm generally. Materialism equals dualism minus mind. Naturalism is the related idea that science should investigate only natural causes. The supernatural departs, and along with it, teleology, the idea that purposes can be worked out in nature and invoked to explain it. Determinism, the idea that every event is made to happen by natural causes alone, follows. Materialist reduction may take various forms, depending on what exactly is done with the mental realm of thought, ideas, and experience. The most radical materialists, like Daniel Dennett and Paul and Patricia Churchland, are eliminative materialists. They believe there simply are no experiences. When we now speak, for example, of feeling pain or thinking of elephants, one day we will speak only of firings of the relevant neurons in our brains. More moderate are the reductive materialists. who allow a degree of reality to thoughts and feelings, but believe that when we speak of such things, we are really speaking about what is going on in our brains. Finally, there is supervenience, the idea that things really do go on in our minds, but that every change in a mental state is accompanied by a change in the physical state of our brains. Related to this is epiphenomenalism, the idea that what goes on in the mind is a kind of shadow accompaniment to the physical events in our brain. We are zombies in denial. We think we are making things happen by our intentions, but the real causes of those intentions and actions lie in our brains. None of these alternative forms of materialism allow mind to make a real difference to the material world. So materialism seems to commit us to either atheism or pantheism. Atheism rejects any kind of God who can be at all relevant to our world. And an irrelevant God is obviously not the God anyone would want to have any reason to believe in. Pantheism holds that God makes no difference to the world because God is the world. Everything that happens in the world is God's activity, and everything in the world is part of God. In Western philosophy, pantheism has been rare, Spinoza being the main example. Pantheism sounds like the polar opposite of atheism, but Richard Dawkins declares that pantheism is just sexed up atheism. Of course, one could turn that on its head and say atheism is just a prudish form of pantheism. Not quite true, however, because Spinoza's pantheism enables him to incorporate a considerable amount of what theology says about God, and hold together aspects at least of theism and naturalism, which is no mean achievement. Materialism would seem forced to be atheistic or pantheistic, but the converse is not true. Atheism is compatible with a range of spiritualities. Philosopher John Gray lists 7 forms of atheism. These range from raging defiance like that of the new atheists, through belief in progress, through scientific advance, to the calm of the kind of non-theism one finds in Santayana and in forms of Buddhism. Materialism, after coming to dominate philosophy in the mid-20th century, has been much criticised of late. Though it retains an intense attraction to many, arguably materialism faces a wider range of difficulties than most worlds. Philosopher Robert Coombs cites some 50 modern philosophers, some materialists themselves, who have mounted arguments against materialism, and at least 14 recent anti-materialist arguments. These include several intriguing thought experiments discussed in 10 ways. Most of the arguments are based on difficulties materialism has in accounting for aspects of our mental life. Recalcitrant aspects include qualia, or qualities, such as the redness of the squirrel, intentionality, or our ability to think and feel in relation to things in the world, and value, including ethical value, which seems bound up with quality. As Daniel Dennett reports a fellow materialist, Wilfrid Sellers, saying, while drinking a fine wine, "It's qualia that make life worth living." The occurrence of qualia may be predicted by material events. For instance, when these neurons fire, I will see red. But science cannot tell me why it is red I see, not blue, or the sound of a trumpet, or nothing at all. A more subtle line of argument brings to light an incoherence in the very idea of matter. The more hard line we get as materialists, insisting on matter as the only reality, the more elusive matter becomes. Nobody can tell us exactly what it is. This elusiveness is not something science could one day get beyond, finally announcing its discovery of what matter is. No, it is inherent in the way materialism defines matter. Matter say a worm or an atom, is defined in two ways: what it is made up of and how it interacts in terms of mathematical law with other things. The first way pitches us into a regress of explanations. A worm is defined in terms of its organs, and those in terms of molecules, and molecules in terms of atoms, and those in terms of quarks, and so on down. Eventually we may reach a level too small for our apparatus to penetrate, or too difficult for our mathematics to formulate, or both. In that case we have to say we do not know what matter ultimately consists in. And there may even be no bottom layer. Maybe matter is what the philosopher McTaggart described as gunky. Maybe it just goes subdividing into smaller units ad infinitum. So materialism fails to clarify what matter really is. The second way of defining matter is in terms of its mathematical law-like relations to other matter. An atom of, say, chlorine is defined in terms of its law-like, predictable tendency to combine with other atoms like sodium to form molecules like salt. But this creates a similar problem. We are left with a set of mathematical laws without actually knowing what it is those laws correlate. To use Bertrand Russell's analogy, just as Lewis Carroll's Cheshire Cat disappeared, leaving only a grin, but the grin of what? So matter disappears into mathematical relations, but relations between what?